thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this session as part of the Subjectivity conference. I'm Barry O'Leary, and I'm an immigration and nationality lawyer at Wesley Grigg Solicitors in London. I'm also a member of the Subjectivity Advisory Board, so I've been working with them on this project for the last 4 years. So it's very, very exciting to get to this stage where we have this conference to bring so many people together. I'm a bit older than lots of the contributors, and I've been representing LGBTQI asylum seekers for nearly 20 years. So I think a lot of the discussions that we have at the moment are about the negative parts of the system and how it has to be improved. And that's absolutely right. That's what we must do. But I think for one of the things for me, looking at the different sessions that we've already had today, is just how far we've come and how it's so exciting to see so many wonderful minds and resources being put to this issue when it felt quite a lonely place in the early 2000s. And I think what's also important, I think needs to be improved on, but is very important that I'm seeing is the voices of the refugees themselves are being amplified and coming out more and more and more, which is good. And I hope it's something that happens throughout the conference. I want to say before I introduce the session and before I introduce the panelists that what you don't see in the background when you come to this session is there's always a facilitator that's working behind the scenes to make sure that everything's happening. So I just want to say in advance, thank you very much to Ezra Carl-Colosio, who is not only doing this session, but she's facilitating lots of other sessions. Now, this session is on credibility, and it's one of 3 sessions on credibility that's going to be a part of this conference. There's another one tomorrow at 11 AM and a third one on Thursday at 1 PM. And the fact that we've split it into 3 different sessions, I think is just a sign of how important this issue is in refugee claims in general and in SOGI claims. And I know from the UK experience that as certain issues like go by the wayside, credibility has become more and more important. And actually, just to be frankly honest, it's the tool the Home Office use to refuse claims when they want to. So when the country of origin is clearly not in dispute that their persecution can take place there. So it's a really, like I said, the session, it's a really relevant, important topic, and I'm glad that we're getting to have 3 sessions to give it the recognition it deserves. And I'm just going to have to pull up another screen. Right, okay, so we have two papers today. The first one is entitled, "What is a Credible Narrative? The Problematic Utilisation of Credibility in SOGI Asylum Determination in European Asylum Courts." And this is the work of both Dr. Nicole Hurlerer and Dr. Nick Gill. Now, luckily we have both of them here today. Nicole is going to give the presentation, but Nick will be around for the Q&A session afterwards. The second paper is The Essential is Invisible to the Eyes, Complexities Regarding the Concept of Perceived Sexual Orientation and its Legal Implications in Asylum Procedures Credibility. And this is going to be given by Lucas Ramon Mendoz. Now, Lucas was very near the time of the conference, actually called to give a speech at the Palace of Nations for the UN on behalf of the immigration law, the International Lesbian and Gay Association, which is quite a good excuse. So he very luckily has actually videoed his presentation for us, and he hopefully will join us, but we're just going to have to wait and see about that. Now, just to let you know, this part of the conference is being videoed and recorded, but we will, after that, turn the recording off for the Q&A session. Though that Q&A is all going to be by typing at the bottom of the screen, I'm afraid, because given the number of people involved in confidentiality issues, that we decided that we have to go that way. Okay, now, so I am going to shortly hand you over to Nicole. If you just give me 2 seconds. So I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Nicole. Okay, just 2 seconds. Okay, so Nicole is an anthropologist, and she's got extensive research experience in migration and refugee studies. Her ethnography on refugee resettlement in the UK laid bare the practice policy gap in the UK's migration service provision. She's the lead researcher for the ASIFAIR research project and is responsible for research conducted in Germany and Austria. And I'm going to turn my screen off at that point and hand you over to Nicole.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. And I would like to start by thanking the Sotica team for organizing this conference in these unprecedented times. And I also want to thank Barry and Ezra for chairing and facilitating this session. So we are going to talk today about credible narrative. I've slightly amended the title because we focus more on subjective credibility assessments, and we will be mostly drawing on our ethnography. Because I'm the presenter, I will focus predominantly on Germany, but we are part of a larger research team at the University of Exeter, and as Nuno pointed out today, we are also funded by the ERC, and the PI, Nick Gill, is hosting this project. Now, a little bit about our project. The journey of an asylum seekers in Europe is more or less the same, but ASyFair focuses on one specific aspect of this journey, which is the court stage, where appellants can appeal a first instance or a ministerial decision. So we focus exclusively on that. And the right to appeal a negative asylum claim is part of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the right to effective remedy and to a fair trial, which applies both to European citizens as well as asylum seekers in Europe. The research focus of our project is on consistency and inconsistency in legal procedures, predominantly collecting data on judges and other legal professionals rather than asylum seekers per se. We do that by 4 research methods. We have conducted 850 legal ethnographies at public asylum court hearings in the UK, Germany, France, Austria, and Belgium. In conjunction with that, we have collected 600 statistical data sets on quantifiable factors such as age, gender, the timing, weekdays of hearings, the numbers of questions, etc. We've also conducted approximately 80 interviews in Italy, Greece, and the UK. And lastly, we have conducted a brief online survey with legal professionals. And we are currently in the data analysis and writing up stage. Now, just before I go into the topic at hand, I would like to mention a few disclaimers that I think are quite important. Now, firstly, ASyFair does not focus exclusively on SOGI claims, so we have not deliberately selected them during our fieldwork, and we only came across them coincidentally. We also observed relatively few SOGI cases at courts, so we therefore struggle to make universal claims. So we present here a few cases from Germany, where, to give you an insight, we only observed 4 SOGI cases out of 282 cases overall, so less than 1.5%. In France, our colleague Jessica Hambley observed more SOGI cases, some of them over video link. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into this, but video link introduces an additional problem to hearings. And all our cases concern gay men rather than other sexual orientations. We have selected distinct examples for this presentation that we found particularly problematic and shocking. So we want to show you what's actually happening on the ground in the courts. So as a research team, we are well aware of the problems that come with such expressions and the problematic terminology in SOGI claims, but we present it verbatim. And we want to emphasize, therefore, that the examples that we use do not reflect the opinions or views of the ASyFair research team. Just very quickly on the obligations in credibility assessments. So they are both obligations for decision makers and for asylum seekers, and we have only selected a few of many. So firstly, to ensure fair procedures, asylum seekers should have the opportunity to explain any discrepancies in the narrative. Secondly, decision makers should take into account personal features and circumstances such as age, gender, ethnicity, and the level of education. And importantly, to which we come later, assessments are based on COI and evidence and not subjective understandings of the decision maker. But as we see, this is often not the case. There are also obligations for asylum seekers, but these are very problematic, of course. Coupled with other problems such as the language barrier, mistranslations, and the lack of good or any legal representatives, often asylum seekers are not able to meet these obligations. But here, just a few of them. Narratives should be detailed and internally consistent throughout the procedure. Narratives should be consistent with country of origin information, which is a very big problem for a lot of them. And also the narrative should be corroborated with evidence, which is another big problem in SOCI cases. I want to add to that in comparison to criminal law, asylum cases do not have the principle of the benefit of the doubt. So rather than in doubt for the asylum seekers, the burden of proof is not shifted from the asylum seeker to the state or the court. I'm sure you're all familiar with the CJEU verdict from December 2014. We have selected a few elements we think are important for our presentation. This verdict showed what can or should and should not be done in the assessment of SOCI claims. One of them is discrete examination that should consider the sensitive nature of questions concerning sexuality. And credibility cannot or should not be assessed negatively because sexual orientations are not revealed from the outset of the asylum application, or asylum seekers refuse or struggle to reveal intimate aspects of their life. The verdict also stated a few assessments that should not be done, so impermissible assessments, for example, detailed questions about sexual activities, requesting any images, including videos of sexual acts, or as was pointed out already in session 4 today, carrying out medical research into the sexual orientation of asylum seeker. However, what we have found in our research is that judges do often employ subjectivity and credibility assessment, and they are very difficult to research, but more difficult to quality check and to control. As was pointed out by Keegan, subjective assessments are highly personal to the decision maker. They are dependent on personal judgments. They often lack articulated logic. And as I said, they're difficult to review and are likely to be inconsistent from one decision maker to another. Now, I want to give you an example of one of these problematic subjectivities the judges employ, with one of the judges saying to me in one of the court cases, I'm surprised with the population boom in some African countries, considering that so many of the asylum seekers from there claim to be homosexuals. So first of all, this is clearly a racist statement. It can be characterized as this, but it also shows that often judges believe that sexual orientation claims are nothing more than an asylum tactic. So a tactic in order to get forms of protection. A second example we want to show is one judge said to the appellant during a court hearing, refugee protection due to homosexuality requires that I am convinced that you are significantly shaped by a homosexual identity, but I have my doubts. I want to draw your attention to what he said, I am convinced. So it's very much about subjectivity, and they not only are aware of it, but they also demand it. And then they are very vocal, as you can see here, to make the asylum seeker aware that their so-called quote unquote homosexual identity is put into doubt. From an anthropological perspective, what is more problematic or equally problematic are the so-called Western lens. So a Western yardstick, a Eurocentric yardstick that is used. Assessments may be based on culturally biased understandings of sexual orientation, which may affect the judge's assessment of credibility. and may have direct bearing on the judge's understanding of the risks involved in a person's deportation. I want to present to you a case study that was a male judge under 45 years old concerning a male appellant under the age of 30 who had no legal representative present during the case. It was probably the most uncomfortable and inconsiderate hearing I have attended during my field work, and really shows that subjective lens that judges are employing. So in the first quote, I should mention perhaps beforehand the facts of the case. The appellant had a sexual affair with a co-worker. Both of them worked as garbage collectors and on a landfill site. And the judge put the credibility of the story in doubt by saying, now you tell me that you had sex with someone who collected garbage all day. That's not very appetizing. I can imagine that after a day of work without a shower and without a change of clothes at a landfill site, that is not particularly nice. I find this hard to believe. The appellant replied to that, we are not like Europeans. In a second instance, the same judge found it impossible to believe that the appellant and his sexual partner at the time would watch pornography before or during engaging in sexual activity. And he kept questioning it, for example, by, just so I understand, you started to have sex with a colleague after you watched pornography in the car together. So in both of these instances, you can see that questions of personal hygiene and also sexual practices tell us nothing about the actual sexual orientation of a person. So we can almost speak as an anthropologist of a Eurocentric pollution belief when it comes to personal hygiene. Lastly, this judge was particularly problematic by shifting the blame for the threats the appellant has received in his country of origin after they were discovered to the appellant themselves. And he said, so why would you have homosexual intercourse with someone on a landfill site where other people are and where you could be discovered? And the appellant tried to explain that there was no other place they could have met, but it was very clear from the judge's expression that he does not believe that. So obviously the last example is very pertinent because it speaks to the concealment and discretion problem that was actually also in one of the CJEU verdicts as impermissible, but the judge nevertheless employed that. As a last example, I would like to discuss the judge's views of relationships. In this case, a male judge around the age of 45 heard a case of a male appellant under 30 who left his boyfriend in his country of origin. It's important to say that in this case, the appellant actually had a legal representative. The judge kept questioning the breakup in the relationship, saying, so you were with your partner for 10 years, but you decided to just leave him and leave the country after all that you have gone through together. You just leave him behind? I find this hard to believe. The appellant tried to explain the reasons why his partner stayed behind, and they are currently not in touch because they had a fight and he hinted on infidelity there. But the judge could not let this go and went on by saying, so after 10 years, you just say, I don't care. I find this dispassionate. But this is more of a comment now. However, the lawyer had none of it and retorted, these are matters of the heart. Gay people are also allowed to look for a new partner. And here the lawyer emphasizes that generally the relationships simply are this way. People fall in love, people fall out of love, people get together, people break up. But the judge, on the other hand, appears to suggest that especially in Sochi relationships, people who undergo trials and tribulations together, they would simply stay together. And worse than that, he says that the breakup is dispassionate, without any emotions. And this tells us again more about the judge's views of relationships, what relationships should be, rather than actually telling us anything about the credibility of the appellant's claim. And we can compare that to other judges that we have observed that, for example, argue that an asylum claim is not credible because the Sochi claimant has been married in their country of origin. We shall return to this in a few minutes. Now, from our perspective, and this has also been addressed by Gerardo and Edward in session 4 earlier today, we would perhaps suggest the eyes of the persecutor test rather than credibility assessments, which bases assessments on the persecution that arises in the eyes of the persecutor in the country of origin, from the observable as well as the ascribed behavior that led the persecutor to perceive that the victim is a member of the targeted group. Therefore, the focus should shift from credibility to actually what is happening in the country of origin. And regardless of whether the appellant is a so-called genuine Sochi claimant, this behavior can still be ascribed by a state or non-state actor, leading to persecution. And this assessment should be based on country of origin information and assessment rather than credibility assessments of what is happening in the country of refuge, for example. On the last slide, just a few other suggestions from our end. What should be taken into account with Sochi claims are sociocultural factors. As I mentioned before, Sochi claimants may have been married in their country of origin, but not because they are not genuinely Sochi claimants, but could be either because of concealment or simply because arranged marriages are a normal thing in their country of origin. Also, it should be taken into account that the real life experience of asylum seeker may differ from the judge's expectations as well as the country of origin information. I'm sure I'm telling you nothing new when I suggest that judges should receive further training, but they should also not employ stereotypes. We have often heard that a Sochi claim is not credible because a Sochi claimant is not an active member of the gay scene in their country of refuge, for example, in Germany. And I conclude again with the reiteration that focus should be on persecution in the country of origin rather than credibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I was absolutely fascinated. It's an excellent presentation. You would think that you would stop being shocked by some of the examples of things that are actually said and credibility assessments that are made and what they're based on. And yet the examples you've given still are absolutely shocking. And I think one of the things that strikes me very much when you talk about those as well is that something that Prosi Kakuzo, who's also on the advisory board, has just tweeted about from session 4, the intersectionality of some of these things, that some of the quotes you gave were clearly both homophobic and racist. And both those things are operating together in that subjective judge's mind to actually produce those results. Wow, it is really quite shocking, but I'm very grateful for the presentation. Okay, I'm going to move now to Lucas's presentation. So the next presentation is by Lucas Ramon Mendoz. Lucas is a lawyer, lecturer and researcher who specialises in international human rights law and sexual and gender diversity issues. He earned his law degree with a focus on international law from the University of Buenos Aires and his master's degree on sexuality in the law from the University of California in Los Angeles. He has worked as an attorney with the LGBTI Rapporteurship of Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Williams Institute International Programme. He has served as a defence attorney for asylum seekers with the Office of the Defender General in Argentina and as an advisor on SOGI ESC issues to the Human Rights Secretariat of the Province of Buenos Aires. And if you didn't hear me earlier, he's currently given a statement on behalf of the International Lesbian and Gay Association in the UN Palace of Nations. And so, but very kindly has actually pre-recorded his contribution so that we can still hear from him. And I believe, Ezra, you are going to start the recording.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lucas Ramon Mendoz, and in the following 15 to 18 minutes, I will be sharing with you a few ideas regarding the complexities around the concept of perceived sexual orientation and its legal implications in asylum procedures. So this is the roadmap that we will be following. First, we will just acknowledge that UNHCR states that persecution can be based either on the actual or the perceived sexual orientation. So to better understand that notion, we will first visit the definition of sexual orientation and then dive into the most common forms in which sexual orientation is said to be perceived, mostly dealing with stereotypes that then lead to persecution. We'll then explore how the focus on the credibility, which should revolve around the asylum seeker's account, shifts towards the asylum seeker's identity in many of these cases when poorly managed. And we'll see the negative impact of stereotypes on asylum claims. We'll very briefly explore how UNHCR's relevant documents deal with this issue, and hopefully get to the conclusion with the main takeaway ideas. So without further ado, now we'll land on the main instrument dealing with international protection issued by UNHCR on these issues. And we see that we are presented with the idea of perceived sexual orientation at the very beginning, at a very early stage of the document. It is actually on paragraph 1 that we are introduced to this idea of perceived sexual orientation, as we see that UNHCR states that individuals experience serious human rights abuses and other forms of persecution due to their actual or perceived sexual orientation. And we will see that every single time the document makes reference to sexual orientation, it'll speak to both actual or perceived sexual orientation. So we're introduced to this idea, this notion of perception of sexual orientation being something that we can actually perceive. But let us explore a little bit more the definition of sexual orientation to see if that is actually a possibility or there's something else we need to look into this issue of perception. So when we define sexual orientation, we usually make reference to a three-pronged definition that encompasses the dimension of desire or attraction, the dimension of behavior or acts, and the dimension of identity. So let us go one by one and see to what extent we can say that these dimensions can be actually perceived or read externally by a third person. Right? So in terms of desire, if we're actually talking about the attraction that a person experiences or feels towards another person based on their gender, whether it is a person of the same gender or of a different gender, we will be in a very difficult situation trying to explain how that can be perceived externally, right? As you may have heard, you might be familiar with a few cases in several countries, there have been efforts to measure this dimension of sexual orientation with machines and devices trying to gauge the reactions, the bodily reactions of asylum seekers when they were exposed to pornographic material or erotica. So these mechanisms are completely lacking of scientific support and have been declared incompatible with human dignity by several human rights bodies. So in this way, we can say for certain that desire is a dimension that we will not be able to perceive. Behavior, on the other hand, might have some aspects that will allow for some level of perception, for actual interpretation or reading into certain acts or behaviors that will tell us something about the sexual orientation of the person. But we'll get to that in a minute. But finally, the dimension of identity. There's nothing in the behavior of a person that might speak to their embraced identity other than the ones that we're seeing here in the icon here. For instance, someone waving a flag, a rainbow flag, or having some kind of t-shirt saying I'm gay or whatever, but all of these indications are very fallible. This is not something that will tell us something for certain about the identity. The only way to know the identity of a person for certain regarding their sexual orientation is having the person say it, to have an externalization of that identity by the person. Therefore, the element of identity is another one that is very, very difficult to perceive or read externally. We need the person to actually externalize that identity for us to be able to be aware of it. So let us dive into the most common ways in which sexual orientation is said to be perceived. So taking from the previous slide, we said that actual behaviors could, in a way, give us some information regarding the sexual orientation of the people involved in some kind of sexual or romantic interaction. This might tell us about a non-heterosexual orientation, but we would even be hard-pressed to accurately define the sexual orientation of a person just by witnessing or watching a mere act or interaction. And this can even be fallible to the extent that heterosexual people can be wrongly read as interacting romantically or sexually when nothing the like of that might be happening. So you might be familiar with a few cases reported a few years ago, one in Brazil, which was particularly tragic. Two brothers that were leaving a party. One of them was, heavily drunk, and the other one was trying to assist him and leaving and trying to get into the car. As he was, carrying his brother in his arms, then they were read by a gang as if they were a gay couple. So they were attacked, and even one of the brothers was killed in the attack. So as you can see, this tells us something about the sexual orientation, but it's not at all a reliable way to perceive this characteristic. Gender expression is another characteristic, is another trait that is usually read to infer a sexual orientation. And this has to do with stereotypes regarding gender expression and sexual orientation. So the way we dress, the makeup we wear, the ways in which we talk, and the ways in which we move our hands when we talk, a wealth of information that we send out to the world that is read under culturally set standards of masculinity and femininity in a binary way. So men who do not abide by the standards of masculinity as defined in a certain time in some culture, and women who do not align with parameters of femininity tend to be read under this light as non-heterosexual, conflating their gender expression with their sexual orientation. And as well, gender identity in places where there is very little understanding of gender and sexual diversity. Trans people are usually labeled as homosexual, and all of the terms and derogatory words that are used to describe gay men are usually attributed to trans women, and same thing for trans men and cis women. And this is also the case with partners of trans people who are maybe also perceived as engaging in non-traditional or non-conventional sexual relations, or directly being associated with being homosexual. Culturally fixed gender roles has some relation to what we were saying before to gender expression, but not necessarily. So the fact that people engage in certain conducts, certain professions, that they have certain hobbies, or they have, made decisions in terms of how they lead their lives, who they live with, can actually be read in ways that people infer from that information that they are not heterosexual. So, just to mention a few examples, this is usually the case with women who are into soccer that are read as non-heterosexual. Like two people of the same gender sharing a household, so living together, even if there's no information regarding to what extent they are involved in a sexual or in a romantic relation, or just men who work at beauty parlors or are into hairstyling. So all of these unconventional, quote unquote, or conducts that don't align with expectations of what men and women should do or behave, or the roles that you take, read in a binary way, usually lead to people, to this perception of non-heterosexuality. And finally, we can mention, the participation in events in which LGBT people may participate as well. So those who participate and take part in activities related to the LGBT community or the LGBT community at large, or they take part in activities that might be reported in the media. There were several cases of situations in which LGBT people were reported on the media as participating with others who were just there because they were supporters, they were friends, they were family members. And even more common would be the situation of a defender, that it might be associated with a non-heterosexual person just because they socialize or they participate in events where they are. So all of these traits, all this wealth of information that, with the exception of the first one, have nothing to do with the actual sexual orientation, then lead to this perception, and the perception then triggers the persecution. Right, so this is what happens on the ground, and this might be the reason for which the person will eventually claim asylum, based on the perception that others had regarding their sexual orientation. It's quite interesting to note as well that the UNHCR guidelines refer to imputed sexual orientation only once in the document. So the document uses the term perceived, with the exception of one paragraph in which the word imputed is used. So in my personal view, the perception, the way in which we frame perception, allows us to think that there are elements in what we see that provide support for the conclusion, even if there are elements that we may then question with a critical approach. However, the fact that we may refer to imputed the way we do with political opinions or with religious groups or beliefs, then might be a little bit more appropriate in that it is arbitrary in nature, and the cases in which we have seen that gender expression, gender identity, or culturally fixed gender roles, or even participating in activities is used as a basis for perceiving people in a way, imputed might eventually be a more appropriate term to describe these situations. This would also help question and denounce the fact that these perceptions are based on stereotypes, and there's nothing that we can actually read about the sexual orientation of a person in any of the elements that are here on this chart. As I said again, with the exception of the first one, but yet to a limited extent, even in that case. So that's interesting. It might be something that UNHCR thought when producing the document, but that's just one interesting element. So now that we have a clearer understanding of how key the element of perception is in analyzing the reason for persecution, let us analyze another element, another aspect of an asylum proceeding that might be negatively impacted by perception. And this is usually the case with poorly trained state officials that are not aware, that are not sensitized about these issues. And it's usually the case that we've seen in many reports that instead of focusing on internal and external consistency for credibility purposes, focusing on the information available provided by the asylum seeker, by testimonies, from witnesses and other information on the file, then there's a shift of the attention towards the identity of the asylum seeker, just to verify whether the information they may have provided on their sexual orientation is actually true, and the identity they claim to have, or the identity they claim was perceived, is actually true. And this is also, again, carried out under certain ways of perceiving sexual and gender diversity, which might be stereotypical if, again, state officials are poorly trained to deal with these issues. And this will certainly have a negative impact on the claim, if that is the case. This issue is so prevalent that we even have a specific Yogyakarta principle on the matter. It's Principle 23, subsection K, urging states to develop and implement guidelines on assessing credibility in relation to establishing a person's sexual orientation when seeking asylum, and to ensure such assessments are carried out in an objective and sensitive manner, unhindered by stereotyping and cultural bias. However, unfortunately, we are familiar with the headlines that are now appearing on the right-hand side of the screen. So this is clear indication that judges and decision makers in general are still using their stereotypical views on sexual and gender diversity to make decisions in asylum cases. So let us have a look at the chart that we analyzed a few minutes ago. In this case, the perceptions, the stereotypical notions that the decision maker, be it the eligibility officer or a judge or whoever is in charge of making a final decision based on the information on the file, holding this stereotypical views, will negatively impact the case in what we could label like the flip side of how perception operates on the ground. So in this case, those stereotypical notions will be used to deny international protection to those who do not conform to the stereotypical views held by the decision maker. So for instance, we've seen male asylum seekers who adhere to the stereotypical views of masculinity that were denied protection because they were not quote unquote gay enough, or they didn't have the demeanor or the ways of expressing the ideas that the decision maker was expecting from someone who is claiming to be non-heterosexual. We've seen that with several cases in which the conduct in which they engaged before claiming asylum was held against them because it did not align with how or the way in which non-heterosexual people would behave, and so on and so forth. The two instruments that we referred to before, issued by UNHCR, both the Guidance Note of 2008 and the Guidelines of 2012, do address these issues. Of course, much of the language could be improved, but it's good to know that there are standards, and we can use these standards as tools when these stereotypical views are used to deny protection. So to wrap up, a few takeaway ideas to share with you. The first one would be that the notion that sexual orientation can be legitimately perceived carries problematic ideas that validate stereotypes. So it's always good to have a critical approach to the notion of perceived sexual orientation, as we have seen throughout the presentation. So we have also explored how stereotypical perception of sexual orientation can trigger both persecution and denial of protection. So hence the importance of this issue and the need for specific training and sensitization on these complex issues. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to be able to be around for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Lucas.